The champagne flute shattered. Not from a drop. From her hand freezing mid-pour. Because staring up at her wasn't just any billionaire client, it was him. The man who vanished 15 years ago, leaving her with nothing but scars and questions. Now he's back, dripping in wealth at her table. And the look on his face? He doesn't even recognize her. This wasn't a reunion. This was a collision course set 15 years in the making, and she just dropped the first bomb. Hey, story lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go. The Ghost in Booth 7. Joylene Martinez had perfected the art of invisibility. In the upscale restaurant where she worked, she moved like a shadow between tables, pouring wine for tech moguls and celebrities who looked right through her. It was safer that way. Invisible meant untouchable. Invisible meant protected. But protection was an illusion that shattered the moment Clement Wellington walked through those mahogany doors. The other waitresses whispered excitedly as the maitre d' personally escorted him to the VIP section. Forbes Tech Innovator of the Year. The man who'd revolutionized cloud computing and amassed a fortune that could buy small countries. Joylene had seen his face on magazine covers, business news segments, billboards across the city. Always that same confident smile, those piercing blue eyes that once promised her the world. She'd built her entire life around avoiding this moment. Joylene, you're on table 7, her manager whispered, not looking up from his clipboard. VIP treatment. Don't mess this up. Her legs felt like water as she approached the corner booth. 15 years. 15 years of therapy, of rebuilding herself from the ashes he'd left behind, of learning to trust again. 15 years of telling herself she was over it, over him, over the girl she used to be. Clement sat alone, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who owned the world. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. His dark hair was streaked with distinguished silver now, his face more angular, more mature. But those hands, those were the same hands that had once traced her face in the moonlight, promising forever. The same hands that had packed his bags while she begged him to stay. Good evening, sir. My name is Joylene, and I'll be your server tonight. The words came out steady, professional. Years of practice had taught her to compartmentalize, to function even when her world was crumbling. He looked up, and for a moment, time suspended itself. Those blue eyes studied her face with the casual interest of someone trying to place a vaguely familiar stranger. She held her breath, waiting for recognition to dawn, for shock to replace that polite smile. It never came. I'll have the 1982 Dom Perignon, he said, already looking back at his phone. And the chef's tasting menu. She wanted to scream. She wanted to slap that dismissive expression off his face. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and force him to see her, really see her, the way he used to when she was 19 and stupid enough to believe in forever. Instead, she smiled and nodded. Of course, sir. I'll bring that right out. As she walked away, her hands began to shake. The champagne bottle felt impossibly heavy in her grip. This was the man who had vanished without a trace when she needed him most. Who had ghosted her completely when she'd called to tell him about the pregnancy. Who had left her to face the miscarriage alone in a sterile hospital room, surrounded by strangers. And now he sat in her restaurant, in her space, ordering champagne that cost more than her monthly rent, completely oblivious to the devastation he'd left in his wake. The weight of memory. The champagne cork popped like a gunshot in Joylene's trembling hands. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, but the memories came flooding back anyway. Northwestern University, sophomore year. She was working 3 jobs to pay for tuition, exhausted but determined. Clement was a graduate student in computer science, brilliant and charismatic, with big dreams and bigger ambitions. He noticed her in the library one night, studying alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by textbooks she could barely afford. "You look like you could use some coffee," he'd said, sliding into the chair across from her. "I look like I could use about 12 hours of sleep," she'd replied, not looking up from her economics textbook. He'd laughed, and something in that sound had made her finally raise her eyes. He was handsome in an understated way, with kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuine in a world full of pretenders. "I'm Clement," he'd said, extending his hand. "Joylene," she'd replied, shaking it. His touch had sent electricity up her arm. "Come on, Joylene. Let me buy you that coffee. You can study there just as well as here, and they have better lighting." She should have said no. Should have trusted her instincts that told her boys like Clement didn't notice girls like her unless they wanted something. But she was 19 and lonely, and his smile had felt like sunlight after months of gray. Now, 15 years later, Joylene forced herself to approach table 7 with steady steps. Clement was on a phone call, speaking in that confident tone she remembered so well. "Yes, the Shanghai deal is moving forward. Make sure Henderson reviews the contracts before." He looked up as she approached, holding up one finger in a gesture that clearly meant wait. She stood there, holding a bottle of champagne worth more than her car, listening to him casually discuss millions of dollars like pocket change. The irony wasn't lost on her. This was the same man who used to count quarters for laundry money, who'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner more nights than not. Success looked good on him. It always had, even when it was just a dream they'd shared in his cramped studio apartment. "Sorry about that," he said, ending the call. "Business doesn't sleep, you know?" She poured the champagne with practiced precision, the golden liquid catching the restaurant's ambient lighting. "I imagine not, Mr. Wellington." He looked at her sharply. "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are, sir." "And you are?" "Joylene Martinez. Your server for this evening." If her last name triggered any recognition, he didn't show it. Joylene Martinez. She'd taken her mother's maiden name after everything. Joylene Chin had died in that hospital room 15 years ago. Joylene Martinez had risen from those ashes, harder and stronger, but infinitely more careful with her heart. "Well, Joylene Martinez," he said, raising his glass, "here's to unexpected encounters." The words hit her like a physical blow. How many times had he said that exact phrase during their 2 years together? It had been their private toast, their way of celebrating the serendipity that had brought them together. Her hand tightened on the bottle's neck. "Indeed, sir. Life has a way of bringing the past full circle." Something flickered in his eyes then, a shadow of uncertainty. But the moment passed, and he was back to scrolling through his phone, effectively dismissing her once again. The unraveling. Joylene retreated to the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs. The other servers bustled around her, preparing orders and gossiping about the celebrity in booth 7, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the roar of her own pulse. "You okay?" asked Maria, the senior server who'd become something of a mentor to Joylene over the past 2 years. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only she knew. "I'm fine," Joylene managed. "Just tired." "Well, shake it off. Mr. Moneybags over there specifically requested you for the evening. Apparently, he was impressed by your professionalism." Maria made air quotes around the word. "If you play this right, you could be looking at a very generous tip." The first course arrived from the kitchen, and Joylene forced herself to return to table 7. Clement had put away his phone and was now studying the restaurant's atmosphere with the calculating gaze of someone who saw everything in terms of investment potential. Your amuse-bouche, sir, she said, setting down the delicate plate. Pan-seared scallop with cauliflower puree and microgreens. Thank you. He took a bite, nodding appreciatively. Excellent. You know, I'm considering investing in the restaurant business. There's something appealing about creating experiences that bring people together. The casual comment felt like salt in an open wound. Clement had always been good at reinventing history, at crafting narratives that painted him in the best light. But Joylene remembered the truth. She remembered the night she'd suggested they open a small cafe together after graduation, how excited he'd gotten about the idea. They'd spent hours planning it, sketching layouts on napkins, dreaming about creating a space where artists and students could gather. That sounds like a wonderful investment, she said neutrally. You sound skeptical. Not skeptical, sir. Just realistic. Restaurants are notoriously difficult. High failure rate. It takes more than money to make them successful. Oh? What else does it take? The question felt like a trap, but Joylene found herself answering anyway. Heart. Commitment. The ability to stick with something even when it gets difficult. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. You speak as if you have experience. We all have experience with things that don't work out as planned. This time, the silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Clement set down his fork and really looked at her, his brow furrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle. Have we met before? He asked finally. Joylene's breath caught. This was it. The moment she'd both dreaded and fantasized about for 15 years. She could tell him the truth, watch recognition dawn in those blue eyes, force him to confront what he'd done. Or she could lie, protect herself the way she'd learned to do, keep playing the role of the invisible server. I don't think so, sir, she said. I have one of those faces. People often think they know me. He studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged and returned to his meal. Maybe so, but there's something. He didn't finish the thought, and Joylene excused herself to check on other tables. But she could feel his eyes following her as she moved through the restaurant, and for the first time in 15 years, the weight of his attention felt like both a gift and a curse. The revelation. The evening progressed with excruciating slowness. Each course brought Joylene back to table 7, back to the careful dance of pretending not to know the man who had once been her entire world. Clement seemed to be studying her more intently with each interaction, his polite small talk taking on an edge of curiosity that made her increasingly nervous. The lamb is exceptional, he said as she cleared his main course. Tell me, Joylene, how long have you been working here? 2 years. And before that? Various places. You know how it is in the service industry. Actually, I don't. His tone was thoughtful rather than condescending. I imagine it's quite different from my world. What made you choose this career? The question was so loaded with irony that Joylene almost laughed. What had made her choose this career? Being abandoned and pregnant at 19, losing the baby, dropping out of college, spending years trying to piece her life back together while battling depression and anxiety. Working her way through a series of dead-end jobs because her dreams had died in a hospital room while he was probably already planning his next big venture. Sometimes life chooses for you, she said instead. Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended, because Clement's expression grew more serious. I'm sorry. That was presumptuous of me. Not at all. You were just making conversation. Was I? He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, the confident billionaire mask slipped, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. Or was I trying to figure out why you seem so familiar? Joylene's heart raced. Like I said, I have one of those faces. No, he said slowly. It's not your face. It's something else. The way you move, maybe. The way you phrase things. There's something about you that reminds me of. He trailed off, shaking his head. This is going to sound crazy. Try me. You remind me of someone I used to know. A long time ago. Someone very important to me. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and electric. Joylene felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from free fall. Important how? She heard herself ask. Clement was quiet for a long moment, staring into his wine glass. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than she'd heard it all evening. I was young. Stupid. I thought I knew what I wanted, what mattered. There was this girl. Joylene, actually. Same name as you. He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in 15 years. Genuine pain. I loved her. Really loved her. But I was ambitious, and when an opportunity came up to join a startup in Silicon Valley. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Joylene knew how the story ended. What happened to her? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him something. I left. Just left. Told myself it was for the best, that she'd be better off without me dragging her away from her dreams. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of the responsibility, scared of failing her, scared of choosing wrong. And now? Now I realize I chose wrong anyway. I built everything I thought I wanted, but… He gestured around the elegant restaurant at the evidence of his success. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. Joylene felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In her fantasies, he was always callous, unfeeling, completely unchanged by time. This vulnerable man sharing his regrets was so much worse than the villain she'd constructed in her mind. Maybe she moved on, Joylene said carefully. Maybe she built a good life for herself. Maybe. I hope so. She deserved better than what I gave her. Which was what? Nothing. I gave her nothing. I promised her everything and then disappeared like a coward. The pain in his voice was so raw, so genuine, that Joylene almost broke character right then. Almost told him who she was, almost let 15 years of carefully constructed walls come tumbling down. Instead, she cleared his plate and murmured something about bringing dessert. The breaking point. In the kitchen, Joylene leaned against the prep counter, struggling to compose herself. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the dessert plate. Everything she'd believed about that night 15 years ago was crumbling around her. She'd convinced herself that he'd left because he didn't love her enough, because she wasn't worth fighting for. But listening to him now, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes, she was beginning to understand that maybe the story was more complicated than she'd allowed herself to believe. Joylene, Table 7 is asking for you specifically, Maria called out. Says he has a special request. Joylene forced herself to walk back to the dining room on steady legs. Clement was signing the check when she approached, but he looked up as she drew near. I wanted to thank you, he said. Not just for the excellent service, but for listening. I don't usually. I don't typically share personal stories with strangers. Sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers, she replied. Less complicated. True. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket. I have a strange request. There's a charity gala tomorrow night. Black tie, very fancy, probably boring as hell. I was wondering if you'd like to accompany me. Joylene stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Excuse me? I know it's presumptuous. And I know you're working. But there's something about you, Joylene Martinez, that I can't shake. You remind me of someone I used to be, someone I was before I forgot how to take chances on people. The irony was staggering. He was asking her out because she reminded him of herself. The perfect, twisted symmetry of it almost made her laugh. I don't think that's appropriate, Mr. Wellington. Clement. Please. And why not? Because you don't know me. Then let me get to know you. She looked at him standing there, confident and vulnerable at the same time, and felt 15 years of carefully constructed armor beginning to crack. This was dangerous. This was exactly what she'd spent years protecting herself against. I can't, she said simply. Can't or won't. Does it matter? He considered this, then pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. My personal number, he said, placing it on the table. In case you change your mind. As he walked away, Joylene picked up the card with trembling fingers. On the back, in his familiar handwriting, he'd written, "For second chances, Clement." She stared at those words until they blurred, until the carefully constructed walls around her heart began to crumble in earnest. The sleepless night. Joylene's apartment was a small studio in a converted warehouse, nothing like the spacious place she'd shared with 3 roommates during college. But it was hers, bought with tips and overtime hours, and it represented something Clement's money never could: independence earned through her own strength. She sat on her second-hand couch, still in her server uniform, staring at his business card. For second chances. The words seemed to mock her from the white cardstock. What would happen if she called him? If she went to that gala and revealed who she really was? Part of her craved the moment of recognition, the shock in his eyes when he realized that the waitress he'd been flirting with was the girl he'd abandoned 15 years ago. But another part of her, the part that had learned to be cautious, wondered if she was strong enough to survive another abandonment. Because that's what would happen, wouldn't it? Once the novelty wore off, once he realized that she wasn't the bright-eyed college student he remembered, but a woman scarred by his choices, he would leave again. Her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Jessica. How was work? Any interesting stories? Joylene stared at the message for a long time before typing back. You could say that. She couldn't tell Jessica the truth. Couldn't explain that the man she'd spent years in therapy discussing had walked back into her life as casually as ordering dinner. Jessica knew about the miscarriage, about Joylene's years of struggle, but she didn't know about Clement. That pain was too private, too raw even after all these years. Another text came through, this one from an unknown number. I know this is forward, but I can't stop thinking about our conversation tonight. If you change your mind about tomorrow, the gala starts at 7. No pressure. Clement. He'd actually texted her. Clement Wellington, tech mogul and billionaire, was texting a waitress he'd known for 3 hours because she reminded him of a girl he'd abandoned 15 years ago. The girl he'd abandoned was her. Joylene stood and walked to her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection. She looked older than her 34 years, the result of too many double shifts and too much stress. Her dark hair was shorter now, her body softer from years of irregular meals and little time for exercise. Would he even recognize her if she told him the truth? Northwestern University, spring of her sophomore year. She was lying in Clement's narrow dorm bed, her head on his chest, listening to him talk about the future. I'm going to change the world, he'd said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Just the world? Dream bigger, she'd teased. Okay, the universe then. But I want to do it with you. With me. With you. Joylene Chin and Clement Wellington, partners in everything. What do you think? She'd kissed him instead of answering, because the idea of forever with this brilliant, ambitious boy had seemed too wonderful to be real. 3 months later, he was gone. Now, staring at her reflection, Joylene wondered what would have happened if she'd fought harder to keep him. If she'd been less understanding when he'd talked about the amazing opportunity in California, less willing to let him go chase his dreams. But she'd been young and insecure, convinced that love meant wanting what was best for the other person even if it destroyed you. She'd smiled and wished him well and cried alone in her dorm room for months afterward. She'd never told him about the pregnancy. By the time she'd worked up the courage to call, his number was disconnected. She'd tried reaching him through mutual friends, but he'd cut all ties to his old life with surgical precision. It was as if Joylene Chin had never existed in his world at all. The miscarriage had happened at 12 weeks. She'd been alone in the hospital, surrounded by strangers, grieving not just for the baby, but for the future she'd imagined. A future where Clement came back, where they raised their child together, where love was enough to overcome anything. That girl had died in that hospital room. Joylene Martinez had been born from her ashes, harder and more cautious, determined never to be that vulnerable again. But sitting in her small apartment, holding his business card, she wondered if maybe it was time to let Joylene Chin have her moment. Time to look Clement Wellington in the eye and show him exactly what his choices had cost. The decision. Joylene didn't sleep. She spent the night pacing her small apartment, alternately reaching for her phone and then pulling her hand back. By dawn, she'd made and unmade her decision a dozen times. The smart thing would be to ignore his text, to request a different section at work, to let him disappear from her life as completely as he had 15 years ago. She'd rebuilt herself once. She could survive maintaining the status quo. But when had she ever chosen the smart thing when it came to Clement Wellington? At 9 a.m., she called in sick to work. At 10 a.m., she was standing in a boutique she couldn't afford, staring at evening gowns that cost more than her monthly rent. Looking for something special? The saleswoman asked, her tone suggesting she'd already assessed Joylene's purchasing power and found it wanting. A gala dress, Joylene said, lifting her chin. Something memorable. 3 hours and most of her savings later, she stood in her apartment wearing a midnight blue dress that hugged her curves and made her look like someone who belonged in Clement Wellington's world. The woman in the mirror looked confident, powerful, dangerous. She almost lost her nerve 6 times while getting ready. What was she doing? What was the endgame here? Was she looking for closure, revenge, or something more complicated? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe after 15 years of wondering what if, she deserved to find out what happened when the past collided with the present. At 6:30 p.m., she stood outside the Four Seasons Hotel, watching black cars deposit elegantly dressed couples at the entrance. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was steady. She was going to walk into that ballroom, find Clement Wellington, and show him exactly who Joylene Martinez really was. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Clement. I hope you're here somewhere. I've been looking forward to this all day. Joylene smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You have no idea what you've been looking forward to, she murmured and walked through the doors. The gala. The Fairmont Grand Ballroom was a monument to luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white silk, while tuxedoed waiters moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. Joylene recognized several faces from magazine covers and business news segments. This was Clement's world now, and she was about to explode into it like a meteor through atmosphere. She spotted him near the bar, devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers. He was telling some story that had them all laughing, the perfect picture of success and charm. For a moment, Joylene's resolve wavered. He looked so at home here, so content with the life he'd built. Then he looked up and saw her. The expression that crossed his face was worth every penny she'd spent on the dress, every sleepless hour of the previous night. Shock, desire, and something that might have been recognition all flickered in his eyes as he excused himself from his companions and walked toward her. Joylene, he said when he reached her, his voice slightly breathless. You came. I changed my mind, she said simply. I'm glad. He offered her his arm. Can I get you a drink? Introduce you to some people. In a moment. First, I have something to tell you. Something in her tone must have warned him, because his smile faltered slightly. Of course. Should we find somewhere more private? No. Joylene looked around the ballroom, at all the beautiful, successful people who comprised Clement's new world. I think here is perfect. She took a deep breath, feeling 15 years of silence gathering behind her words like water behind a dam. You said last night that I reminded you of someone. Someone important from your past. Yes, Joylene Chin, she interrupted. Northwestern University, 2009 to 2011. Computer science major with a minor in economics. She was going to change the world, remember? The color drained from Clement's face. He stared at her as if she were a ghost, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Hello, Clement, Joylene said softly. It's been a while. The confrontation. Joylene. Clement's voice was barely a whisper. Joylene Chin. Martinez now. I changed my name after my old life ended. He was staring at her as if she might disappear if he blinked, his confident businessman persona completely shattered. I don't understand. How are you here? Why didn't you say something last night? Because I wanted to see if you'd remember me. If I'd made any lasting impression on the man who promised me forever and then disappeared without a word. The conversations around them continued, but Joylene felt as if they were enclosed in a bubble of tense silence. Clement looked around nervously, clearly aware that they were attracting attention. We should talk somewhere private, he said. Should we? The way we talked 15 years ago? Oh wait, we didn't talk then, did we? You just left. Joylene, please. Let me explain. Explain what? How you packed your bags while I was at work. How you disconnected your phone. How you made sure I had no way to reach you when I found out I was pregnant. The word hung between them like a bomb blast. Clement went completely still, his face ashen. Pregnant, he repeated. Surprised? I was too. 8 weeks along when I finally worked up the courage to take the test. Of course, by then you were already gone, already starting your new life in California without any messy emotional entanglements. Joylene, I didn't know. You have to believe me, I didn't know. How could you know? You made sure I couldn't tell you. People were definitely staring now, conversations quieting as the drama unfolded. Clement noticed too, his executive instincts kicking in as he tried to manage the situation. Please, he said urgently. Can we go somewhere private? This isn't the place. This is exactly the place, Joylene cut him off. This is your world, Clement. These are your people. They should know what kind of man they're celebrating. What happened to the baby? He asked quietly, and the genuine anguish in his voice almost undid her. Miscarriage. 12 weeks. I was alone in the hospital, surrounded by strangers, grieving for our child while you were probably celebrating your first round of funding. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. 15 years of suppressed pain and rage were pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. I tried to find you, Clement said desperately. Later, after I got established, I tried to look you up. But Joylene Chin had disappeared. I thought maybe you'd gotten married, changed your name. I did change my name. Because Joylene Chin died in that hospital room. Joylene Chin was naive enough to believe in forever, stupid enough to think love could conquer anything. Joylene Martinez learned better. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice broke on the words. God, Joylene, I'm so sorry. If I had known. If you had known what? You would have stayed? Married me out of obligation? Resented me for ruining your big chance? No, I would have. I don't know what I would have done, but I wouldn't have left you alone. But you did leave me alone. You left me so completely that I couldn't even tell you we'd lost our baby. The ballroom had gone almost completely quiet now, hundreds of elegantly dressed people watching the implosion of one of the city's most successful men. Joylene could see phones being discreetly pulled out, could imagine the social media posts and gossip blog headlines that would follow. She should have felt triumphant. This was the revenge she'd fantasized about, the moment when she would show him the consequences of his choices. But all she felt was hollow, exhausted by the weight of carrying this pain for so long. Joylene, Clement said again, and there were tears in his eyes now too. What can I do to make this right? Nothing, she said simply. There's nothing you can do. You can't bring back our baby. You can't give me back those years of struggling alone. You can't erase the therapy, the depression, the years it took me to feel like I deserved to be loved again. But I can try to. No. Joylene stepped back, suddenly feeling completely drained. You can't fix this, Clement. Some things can't be fixed. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. I loved you, he said, and his voice carried across the silent ballroom. I loved you so much it terrified me. That's why I ran. Because I was 24 years old and I couldn't handle the responsibility of loving someone that much. Joylene turned back to him, and for a moment, she saw the boy he used to be. Scared, ambitious, drowning in feelings he didn't know how to process. I know, she said softly. I loved you too. That's what made it hurt so much. The aftermath. Joylene walked out of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom with her head held high, leaving behind a room full of shocked faces and whispered conversations. She could already imagine the headlines: tech billionaire's past revealed at charity gala, the waitress who brought down Clement Wellington. She'd probably lose her job. The restaurant wouldn't want to be associated with that kind of scandal. But somehow, she couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time in 15 years, she felt like she could breathe freely. Her phone started buzzing before she even reached the street. Text after text, most from numbers she didn't recognize. The story was already spreading, probably trending on social media. In the age of smartphones and instant communication, her moment of truth had become public entertainment. One text stood out from the rest. Clement, please. Give me a chance to make this right. I know I don't deserve it, but please don't disappear again. Joylene stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. The reckoning. 3 days later, Joylene was sitting in her apartment, scrolling through job listings on her laptop, when someone knocked on her door. She almost didn't answer it. The media attention had been intense, and she'd already turned away 2 reporters and a producer from a daytime talk show. But something made her look through the peephole, and her breath caught when she saw Clement standing in the hallway. He looked terrible, unshaven, his usually perfect hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. He was holding a large envelope and wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt instead of his usual expensive suits. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. Before you slam this in my face, he said quickly, I have something for you. Something you need to see. Clement, there's nothing you can. Please. 5 minutes. Then I'll leave you alone forever if that's what you want. Joylene studied his face, seeing exhaustion and desperation there. Finally, she stepped aside to let him in. Her small apartment had never felt smaller than it did with Clement Wellington standing in it. He looked around, taking in the second-hand furniture, the small kitchen, the life she'd built from nothing. I've been doing some research, he said, setting the envelope on her coffee table. About what happened after I left. About what your life was like. What kind of research? The kind that should have been done 15 years ago. The kind that would have happened if I hadn't been such a coward. He opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Medical records from Northwestern University Health Services. I had my lawyers track them down. Joylene's blood went cold. You had no right. You're right. I had no right. But I needed to know. I needed to understand what I'd put you through. She looked at the papers, recognizing forms she'd filled out in a haze of grief and shock. Emergency room admissions. Counseling referrals. The official documentation of the worst period of her life. The miscarriage was at 12 weeks, Clement said quietly. You were alone. No emergency contact listed except your roommate, who was out of town. You stayed in the hospital for 2 days with complications, and when you were released, you took a medical leave from school. Stop. Joylene's voice was barely a whisper. The Waitress and the Billionaire. Conclusion. You never went back. You transferred to a community college the next semester, but your grades suffered. You dropped out after a year and spent the next 2 years working minimum wage jobs while battling severe depression. Clement's voice was steady, but she could hear the pain underneath. There are psychiatric evaluations, Joylene. Suicide watch protocols. You almost. Stop. The word came out harsh, final. Joylene grabbed the papers from his hands, her fingers shaking as she saw her own medical history laid bare. You have no right to dig through my pain like this. I know. Clement sank onto her couch, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. But I needed to understand. I needed to see what my choices did to you. To us. And now you've seen it. Are you satisfied? She threw the papers back at him, watching them scatter across her coffee table like fallen leaves. Does it make you feel better to know that I almost didn't survive losing you? That I spent 3 years in therapy learning how to want to live again? No. It makes me feel like a monster. The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the confident billionaire from the restaurant or even the shocked man from the gala. This was someone broken, someone drowning in the weight of consequences he'd finally been forced to face. You want to know the worst part? Joylene sat down across from him, her anger giving way to exhaustion. It wasn't just losing the baby. It wasn't even losing you, not really. It was losing myself. I spent so many years believing that if I'd been worth staying for, you would have stayed. That if I'd been enough, you wouldn't have needed to run. Joylene. I'm not finished. Her voice was quiet, but firm. I built an entire identity around being not enough. Not smart enough, not interesting enough, not worth the effort. Do you know how long it took me to believe I deserved basic human decency? How many relationships I sabotaged because I was convinced they'd leave anyway? Clement was crying now, tears streaming down his face without any attempt to hide them. I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I'm so freaking sorry. I know you are. That's what makes this so hard. Joylene wiped at her own eyes. It would be easier if you were still the selfish boy who ran away. But you're not, are you? You're someone who's learned to live with regret. Every day, he whispered. Every single day for 15 years, I've wondered what happened to you. I told myself you were better off without me, that you'd moved on and found someone who deserved you. But I never stopped wondering. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 15 years pressing down on them both. Finally, Clement spoke again. I can't fix what I did. I can't bring back our baby or give you back those lost years. But I can do something. He reached into the envelope and pulled out another set of papers. This is the deed to a building downtown. I bought it yesterday. It's yours. Joylene stared at him. What? The ground floor is perfect for a restaurant. The upper floors could be apartments or office space or whatever you want. You said once that restaurants need heart, commitment, the ability to stick with something when it gets difficult. You have all of that. Clement, I can't. Yes, you can. There's no strings attached, no conditions. It's not about me trying to buy forgiveness or assuage my guilt. It's about giving you something you should have had 15 years ago, a real choice. Joylene looked at the deed, her name already printed on it in careful legal script. Why? Because you were right at the gala. I can't fix this. But I can finally give you what I should have given you back then. The resources to build whatever life you want. The life you would have had if I hadn't been such a coward. And you? What do you get out of this? Clement stood up slowly, looking older than his 39 years. Nothing. And that's exactly what I deserve. He paused at her door, his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, that girl you think died in the hospital room. She didn't die, Joylene. She grew up. She became someone stronger, someone who survived something that should have destroyed her. That's not nothing. That's everything. After he left, Joylene sat alone with the deed in her hands, staring at the address of a building she now owned. Outside her window, the city hummed with life and possibility. For the first time in 15 years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. 5 years later. The lunch rush at Chen's was in full swing. Joylene moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, checking on tables and greeting regulars by name. The restaurant had become exactly what she'd dreamed of in college, a place where artists and students gathered, where good food and genuine conversation created something larger than the sum of its parts. She paused by the window table where a young couple sat sharing dessert, their fingers intertwined across the table. They reminded her of herself at 19, full of dreams and certainty about forever. She hoped they would be wiser than she and Clement had been. She hoped they would fight for each other when things got difficult. The bell above the door chimed, and Joylene looked up to see a familiar figure entering. Not Clement. She hadn't seen him since that day in her apartment 5 years ago, though she knew he'd quietly established a foundation that provided support for single mothers. This was Dr. Madeline Chin, her therapist from all those years ago, now retired, but still a dear friend. The usual? Joylene asked, guiding her to a quiet corner table. Actually, I have news, Madeline said, her eyes twinkling. My grandson just got engaged. I was hoping I could book your private dining room for the celebration. Of course. Joylene smiled, genuinely happy. Love stories deserve to be celebrated. Speaking of which, Madeline said carefully, I ran into an interesting article yesterday about second chances and the courage to face our past. Joylene raised an eyebrow. Oh. It was about a tech entrepreneur who's been doing remarkable work with at-risk youth. Funny thing is, he credits his inspiration to someone from his past. Someone who taught him that real strength isn't about running from your mistakes, it's about living with them and trying to do better. Joylene's hand stilled on the table. Madeline. I'm not suggesting anything, her friend said gently. I'm just observing that sometimes the people who hurt us also teach us how to heal. And sometimes, when enough time has passed and enough growth has happened, there might be room for something. Not necessarily what was, but perhaps what could be. That evening, after the restaurant closed, Joylene sat in her office upstairs, looking over the books. Chen's was thriving beyond her wildest dreams. She had a staff of 12, a waiting list for reservations, and plans to open a second location next year. She'd built something real, something lasting, something entirely her own. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I read about Chen's in the Tribune. Congratulations. It sounds exactly like what we dreamed about all those years ago. I'm proud of you. See. Joylene stared at the message for a long time. Then, for the first time in 20 years, she typed back, Thank you. Maybe you should come by sometime. We make excellent coffee. The response came quickly, I'd like that. If you're sure. I'm sure, she typed. But fair warning, I'm not the same girl you used to know. Good, came the reply. Neither am I. Joylene smiled and set down her phone. Outside her window, the city sparkled with lights and possibilities. She'd learned something important over the past 15 years. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing. It was about choosing to stop letting past pain control your future choices. Tomorrow, She would serve coffee to a man who had once broken her heart. They would be different people meeting for the first time, carrying their scars and their growth in equal measure. It wouldn't be a reconciliation or a second chance at romance, it would be something entirely new. A conversation between two people who had learned that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from avoiding our ghosts, but from inviting them in for coffee and seeing what they have to teach us. The girl who had believed in forever was gone, but the woman who had learned to believe in today was stronger than she'd ever imagined. And sometimes, Joylene thought as she turned off the lights and headed home, today was enough.